Welcome back. We have our design designed, but now we need to make the bias stems that'll actually create the design on the fabric. So this is what it looks like when it's done. And I want to take you through the steps of how I came to the decision making of this. So let's roll this one out of the way. Remember, this is the design that we're going to make, is this one. And here's the process. Okay, so here's some of the fabrics that I chose. This is what I was going to play with. This is a really cool fabric, and honestly, I think I got it from a friend and something about India. I'm not sure, but this was really cool. Now, this made it a little tricky because these are actually on the diagonal already. I knew that when I used it to try to use it, that I would end up getting different parts of that. So for instance, this one is done and it has those little dots on it here. Here's another one that is done and it's almost all brown stripes. So I've got some different looks by using just this one fabric. So I really liked that. I've chosen to use a medium lighter color, and this one's nice because it does have lines on it. And anytime you're going to cut on the bias, it just is more effective when there's lines on the fabric. Here's another one. That one's got lines. And then this will be my dark with just a little bit of line in it. And then this one. So this is the one that I'll use to show you how to cut them. So you can see that I've got quite a selection. So when I get ready to start working, I know that for this blue and yellow one that I'm going to make at least 4 blocks. I like to get a lot of the bias stems made. So then when it comes time for the actual designing process and I'm putting them down, I have lots and lots and lots to choose from. I don't have to stop and go, oh, I got to pick another color. So let's move these out of the way and bring this piece back. Oh, and we will be using these. These are the Collins, the no melt press bars. They come, there's a set of 5 in there, so 5 different sizes, and we will be using the 1/4 inch size. I showed you a quilt earlier that had the larger cable, and that would have been that size using the wider one. So there are 5 sizes. The very smallest size I find too small to do anything with, but just know there are 5 sizes. All right, so this is the process for cutting the bias stems. So I'm going to start with the piece of fabric. Now, I like to use a 1/2 yard, at the most 5/8 of a yard. If you go more than 5/8 of a yard, your stems end up being almost too long to really deal with. So I would recommend a 1/2 yard to 5/8 of a yard. Okay, this can be done with the fat quarter. The light blue ones that I showed you, those were done with the fat quarter. So you can get a nice selection there too. So here's the fabric, and I've got the fabric. I know it's not real noticeable here. There's the good side, there's the back side. So usually I lay it down with the back side showing. First step is to take the bottom corner and fold it up. And some of you might be thinking to yourself, hey, this looks familiar. We just did this for cutting the bias binding for the double wedding ring. It's the exact same folding technique. So if you're more interested in that, then you could cut back to the double wedding ring episodes and watch that. So it's folded up first, and then this is our bias edge. So let's bring the bias edge down. So now we have the bias edge. This is the edge that we will be cutting. But this is really too long, so I want to fold it one more time to keep it contained. So folding it down. Then I'm going to take this extra end and I just fold it in onto itself and then back again. So now that's folded bias, and then I like to just take this end part here and roll it up. Now I'm going to get my mat out and we're going to cut this. So for doing these cuts, I want to use my larger square ruler. So I've got my Omni Grid here, my 12.5. And on the ruler, I have used the glow tape. So this is the glow tape that I use all the time to use on my ruler. If you've not seen me use it before, you haven't watched enough of my videos. And I place that underneath the ruler on the measurements I want to make, because I am going to power cut these strips. So I'm going to cut these 1.5 inches. It just is easier math when I do it at 1.5. it does waste some fabric. So if you don't have enough fabric to waste, you could go to 1 1/4. I'm just going to do 1 1/2. All right. So I've got it marked at 1 1/2, 3, 4 1/2, 6, 7 1/2, 9. Okay. Let's move these out of the way and bring our fabric back in. So the first thing I need to do is cut off that bias edge. Oops, I want to get that in there snuggled. There. So lining it up, a horizontal line of the ruler, I'm going to cut off this end. And I just discard that one. Then you can spin this around, and I'm going to place this at the 9-inch mark. Okay, so right here, looking at the vertical at 9 inches, but then also looking at the horizontal, making sure that I'm truly square. Ooh, I was off. I'm glad I double checked that. There. All right. So starting at 9, slide it over 1 1/2 inches to 7 1/2, 6. So this is the concept of power cutting. If you have never heard of power cutting, I believe it's episode 102 on the On Point channel. As I discuss all the power cutting, the good things and the reasons and the positives, all that kind of stuff. And the best part about it is it's fast. So I have these all cut. And what's cool about this is each one of these is 2 strips. All right. So these are what I'm going to make into the bias stems. All right. So I have this whole pile that I'm going to sew. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and show you how I set that up. So at my sewing machine, I like to use an iron or a needle case. So that is, let me see if I can get that up so you can see it. That's a needle case. So it's a nice thick case, and I like to use that as my guide. And I tape it down, snuggled right next to the foot of my sewing machine. Now I have my normal A foot on the sewing machine, and I have moved my needle over. Now in this case, I've moved it over to 1.5, and I'll show you why. So I'm going to take the strip, putting it wrong sides together. So this is the right side of this fabric right here, and I'm going to start sewing that with the fold on the inside butting up right next to that needle case. All right. So the reason I like using this, let's put my needle down, is I like that I don't have to be super precise. Just as long as I have that fold there, you can see here the edges are not even together. That's okay. It's all right. You don't have to really worry about the seam allowance. So let me just sew this one little one first, and then I'll show you how you know whether or not you've gotten the seam right. So when I bring this back, I'm going to take, this is the 1/4 inch stick, remember, out of the no melt, and I can push it in there. And I can push it in without it falling off, which means it is not too loose. If you make the seam too big, this will be too loose. And when I pushed it in, it did not stretch it really, really tight. So for me and my machine, this is the perfect tube that I'm creating. So now I'm going to go back and sew some of these together. And then I can grab another and do chain piecing. Whoops. Let's tip it this way. There. So I've got a couple of them sewn. And the next step is to trim off some of this excess. So let's grab my scissors. Now this is a pair of Kai scissors, the 7000 series. They call these the professionals. They are really fabulous. So if you haven't looked into getting a pair of Kai scissors, these are fabulous. And one of the things that makes them so fabulous is they have a serrated edge in here, so it makes it grab the fabric. I love that. It cuts it really fabulous. So now I'm going to trim it, and the trimming of it is so that I'm making it a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch from that seam. So, and I know it might be hard. You know what? I might have a strip here. Let me see. Here, this one. I saved this one just for this so that I could show you that seam. So here we have it. I used a light colored thread here. So my crew is going, good choice, Nancy. Good choice. Look at that, thinking ahead. So now when I trim this, you can see that that seam is just 1/8 of an inch. You don't want there to be too much of a seam here, but then you don't want it to be too small either. If you cut it too small, when you're doing the next step, you will end up splitting the seam, and you'll know right away that was not a good thing. If you make it too big, when you do the pressing, you'll be able to see the seam. So one way or the other, you'll do one or two bad one way and one wrong the other way, and then you'll know the difference. So that is the seam. It's 1/8 of an inch seam past the stitching line. Next, we're going to put this onto the bar and press it. So that is all trimmed now, and now I'm going to put it onto my bar. Now there are other bars that you can buy. These ones just to me have always, I like how sturdy they are. There's some that are a little bit flimsy. There's also some that are made from metal, and those are very painful because when it gets close to the iron, they get really hot. So these would be my preferred bar, okay? So we're going to take that and we're going to tuck it inside that seam. Now what's important here is that the seam itself is near the top. So this is 1/4 of an inch. So the seam is maybe at 1/16 of an inch so that the stitch line is at 1/16 of an inch so that the seam can press toward me so that when you look at it from the top side, you don't see any of the seam allowance at all. Okay, so that's the important placement. And the idea is you just shove it onto the bar and then you move that gathering down until it's all on there. Now this was cut from a 5/8 of a yard strip, the bias, and I told you that it almost gets too long. This is going to take it to the limits. Got to keep pushing it down. So when you're doing that bias, the cutting of the bias like I showed you, you will end up with some really, really long ones and some really, really short ones, and you'll decide which ones are actually useful. The really short ones, I don't throw them away because you never know. Do you need that last little 2-inch piece or not? But so keep that in mind. So this is all of the 5/8 of a yard, the longest stem put onto the bar. Now I want to bring it to the front, so it's right here as close as I can get to this end, and this is when I get my iron out. So the idea is you lay it down, then you bring your iron and you press it. As the iron is coming toward, remember I always lift my iron when I'm moving it, so it's coming a little bit closer. Now I do have the steam on because I like the pressing with the steam. It gives me a very crisp press. But keep in mind it's hot, so don't get too near it. The problem I have most of the time is I'll get too near it, and next thing you know I can't see because it's fogged up my glasses. But don't let it touch your hands. When you're working with this, it's important that you don't stretch the stem. You need the stem to be loose enough coming off the bar that you're not stretching it. If you stretch it coming off the bar, you will not be able to have the flexibility you need the stem to have when you're putting it in your design. Just a little bit more. And like I said, this is a really long bar. There. After I've pressed it from this side, then I'm always going to take and give it another good press this way, making sure that everything is nice and straight and flat. So I've got that one done. I've got this whole bundle that I have over here. I'll get some of these last ones pressed also. And when we come back next time, I'll show you how to transfer your design onto your background fabric and how to apply these stems to the design. See you next time.